Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining this learning experience brought to you by Mesmo. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. Before we dive into things today, I have just a couple of notes to review with you. First off, we are recording our session today. So if you miss any of our conversation, if you'd like to watch again later, or if you'd like to share this with the rest of your team, we will be sending you an email with a link to access the recording on demand, and we'll be sure to send that to you as soon as we finish this live recording today. Now, if you'd like to get involved, there are a couple of ways to do so. Your first option is to use the chat tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. And when you find that chat tab, I'd like you to let us know from where in the world you're joining from today. Now, if you have specific questions, we do want you to submit those using the Q&A tab on the right side of that chat section. We'll do our best to answer questions kind of as they come in, but we definitely have time reserved toward the end to address any that we aren't able to get to. So please do send in your questions when you have them and send them into that Q&A section. Additionally, we will have two polls, one here toward the beginning and one at the end, right before we go into our live Q&A. So keep an eye out for those polls. One will, like I said, be here just shortly. And then if you check out that handout section, you'll see there are a couple of resources there for you. So feel free to check those out and grab those while you're here with us. My final announcement here is that we will be selecting two of our most engaged attendees to win a $50 Amazon gift card. So ways to be eligible are to send in chats and questions, but to also fill out our post-webinar survey. The link is in the handouts, but we'll also post it in the chat toward the end of our session. So today, let's dive right into how to manage telemetry data with confidence. And I'm joined today by Brandon Shelton, Solutions Architect at Mesmo. And we're also joined by Bill Balnave, VP of Technical Services at Mesmo. So Bill and Brandon, thank you so much for joining us here on Techstrong Learning today. Bill, I'm going to pass it on over to you, and we're going to get this first poll kicked off.
Awesome. Thanks, Cody. Big thanks to everybody for joining us. Thanks to the DevOps community. We're really happy to be here, and I absolutely second what Cody said and encourage you to ask questions as we go and be active, and let's make this as interactive as possible. So for the next hour or so, we're going to talk about some of the interesting things being done with telemetry data and what it takes to be able to use the data confidently. Before we do that, I was kind of hoping you would give me a little sense for what your experience is with telemetry data and specifically with telemetry pipeline technology. So if you take 30 seconds and answer the question, I would really appreciate that. Okay. Oh, interesting. I was kind of expecting it to be skewed to one side or the other. It's nice to see that we've got a nice even, well, maybe not so even, kind of an even distribution of people and experience and all of that kind of good stuff. Good. All right. Well, that's help. That helps. I appreciate it. I can kind of tailor our message a little bit to to everybody's experience, from what the heck is it to we're using it. I love it. Look, so let's get everybody kind of on the same page, so we all start from the same place. So some of you know, telemetry data is the stuff that is automatically generated by our apps and the stack that our apps run in, right? So it's logs, it's traces, it's events, and it's metrics. And so, why do we call it out, and what's interesting, and why are we talking about it? Well, we're talking about it for a couple of reasons. One, because it's growing like crazy, and there's a ton of it being generated. And two, because it's really interesting and unique in nature and very different, which makes it very difficult sometimes to take advantage of and to know what to do with it. Last year, almost last year at this time, I had the opportunity to hear Greg Siegfried from Gartner talking about telemetry data and telemetry pipelines. And he referred to it as the wastewater of our infra and apps. And in fact, he had a big slide that said that, or big slide that had the, as he was talking about it, it was just this big pipe draining all this water off into I don't know, into some ditch or something. And it was interesting because his point was not that telemetry data is really just that, like it's waste, we just flush it out because we don't need it. It was more, what he was trying to say is we're flushing it, but it's actually because it's just so difficult to deal with, number one. And number two, most of the time people don't really understand what's in there and how much is in there and what do I do with it, and all of that kind of good stuff. So the first kind of problem is like, I don't know everything that's in there. The second kind of problem is like it's in lots of different formats, and the formats change on a regular basis. The content changes on a regular basis based on changes in applications, based on changes in infrastructure components and things like that. In fact, one of our customers was relaying to us a story of how they made a couple of lines of code changed in an application, but they thought was fairly small change. And a month later, they had a $40,000 overage charge on their observability tool because that code change sparked so much verbosity in their log files and things like that it was crazy. And they just simply didn't expect it and didn't know what was going on. So there's all of that kind of unknown and what's in there, and some of it is structured, some of it is not structured, all those kinds of good things. But then the other part of it is that the context of that data is really temporal, meaning like most of the time, you don't really care that it's in there. Like your apps and your infrastructure components, your microservices, all that stuff, they're all writing their nice log files and everything's going along great, right until you have a security breach or an application outage. And then it's like, no, this is actually the most important data, like scrambling to find it, pull it all together, and all of that. And maybe not so much that now, but like traditionally, that's what telemetry data has been used for, and how we've thought about it, right? Like I'm using it to make sure that my apps are up and running, and if there's a problem, I can go easily hunt that problem down and figure what it is, because that all of that stuff should be revealed to me in error messages and codes and things like that in a log file. And for a certain amount of time, like that's what we did with it, and our use of it was very siloed, and each group kind of had their own set of log files and data that they were looking at, and they could reasonably well figure out what was going on and resolve it, right? But as things got more complicated and infrastructure got more complicated and infrastructure as a service and all of that, it became very clear that really this telemetry data was great, but in order for it to be useful, I need to be able to relate it all together, because there's causality and there's impact and there's all of those kinds of things. And in order for me to see that, I need to kind of have this all in one place. So great, we use observability tools and we dump all of that data in there, and now I've got it in one place, and I can reasonably figure out what's going on and make sense of it. The issue there, though, is that this has become almost unmanageable because of the volume of telemetry data that's being pulled in. And I think what a lot of organizations are seeing is that the juice is maybe not worth the squeeze anymore, as they say, because the amount of data is going up at such a rate, but the value of that data really isn't necessarily increasing, right? So you've got organizations that are paying literally millions of dollars in subscription every year for their various observability tools, and wondering, man, like why do we have to do this, and what's going on? In addition to that, it also seems like now there are a few other players interested, a few other consumers interested in the observability data. So it's not, or the telemetry data. It's not just about observability anymore. It's about security. It's about compliance. And even the notion that there's lots of interesting things in telemetry data that can help with business insights, things around like business transactions and consumer activity and preferences, and all of those kinds of things. So the nature of the value of this data, the interest in this data has changed even yet again, and which kind of necessitated like, oh, we need a different way to deal with this, and we need to be able to do interesting things or work with the data, say further upstream. So this has led to a growing number of vendors looking to build or add telemetry pipelines into their observability platforms, as well as um, folks like us who are just building out kind of standalone telemetry pipeline platforms to be able to deal with the problem. And Michael S., I appreciate the nod. I'm hoping me popping my earbuds back or AirPods in improved the microphone. So thanks for pointing that out. If I cut out again, please let me know. Um, so we look at the objective of the telemetry pipeline as three things. One, to be able to deal with the crazy nature of telemetry data and all the things that I've talked about. Um, Two, to be able to take this data and apply data engineering principles to it, right? Let's make it useful. Let's put it into a format or put it into various formats depending on who the consumer is and what they want to do with it. And then three, I need to be able to deliver it to lots of different consumers. It's not just SREs or support folks anymore. It's maybe the business side, it's security, it's anyone really interested in the things that we can pull out of this telemetry data. So as I've said, different different vendors have looked at building a pipeline as part of their kind of overall observability offering. Other folks are looking at it as kind of a standalone thing. I've pulled up what I would call like a typical architecture for a platform that would support and operate a pipeline. This is how we do it. But look, at the end of the day, like I would tell you, with enough time and money, like anybody could, pull this out. Like this isn't necessarily anything proprietary or special for us. Is that, Brandon? That's a fair statement, right? Like we're not doing anything in here that's McDonald's special sauce.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a ton of options out there, open source. You can go get something from a vendor that's, established. Like you could build all this on your own if you wanted to.
But I think the reason that we're attacking it and looking at it is that like we think that this is pipelines are an important part and actually a necessary part of the overall application stack, should be included and treated like everything else as part of the application stack. But more importantly than that, like as I've been talking about, since this data is really complicated to deal with, like we're trying to pull some of that complication out and get capability to a layer of abstraction where it's easier for more folks to be able to work with the data and get out of it and manage it and all of those kinds of things. So if you look at this and we kind of go left to right, first of all, obviously we're pulling from lots of different sources. Mesmo has an agent that we've had with our log analysis product for many years, but we work with other things as well. Like what's some of the other stuff that we work with, Brandon, here?
So FluentBit is a common one that a lot of people use. FluentBit, FluentD. Datadog has their own agent. We also have our own agent here at Mesmo that you can leverage, right? And that agent is basically the log collector, or the thing that takes the log files off the machine and then sends them somewhere.
Yeah. We also have a component that runs, I'll say, like on premises or quote unquote locally, you will, inside of your network, right? So we recognize that at the end of the day, there's probably some of this telemetry data that you never want to egress away from you, that you want to be able to control it, or maybe you just want to control the volume that you egress, right? And we look at this and it probably makes sense to do some of this capability more locally and not move the data. So we've created the edge component to be able to run some pipelines locally, and then even supply data out to local destinations. Edge is there. It's got some of, but not all of the full pipeline capability that we do in the cloud. And then we also provide Mesmo Analysis as a destination. This is our log analysis product that we had since we were LogDNA. But then obviously we're also supplying to other destinations as well, as I talked about, and not just observability tools, but databases and seams and all of those kinds of things as well. And so as you can see in here, with each module, we've got kind of various capabilities laid out. we think these are the essential things that a telemetry pipeline needs to be able to deal with telemetry data and to give you the confidence to take advantage of all of it. And we thought maybe the best thing to do is rather than sitting and talking about it, let's actually talk about some specific concrete examples. And we're going to talk about 4 of those. So before I jump, I noticed a question from Diana where you're asking in the analysis and index search section, would this be for new data that applies to the 24 hours? It, you know, it, and I'll pop back here. So yeah, you're talking about this area here. So actually, Brandon, I'll ask you, like, what's the best way to answer that?
Yeah, so that Mesmo analysis piece, when we consider index search, a good telemetry pipeline needs some capability to see windows of data. For us, what we've determined is about 24 hours is good enough within a telemetry pipeline for you to be able to evaluate, make decisions on, and figure out how do I want to tune my pipelines for things, right? Everything else should go to a traditional log analysis solution like our own that we actually host, or Datadog, or if you're sending stuff to Seam, Splunk, any of those ones that are really meant for longer term retention, 7, 14 days, whatever your business is requiring for that, right? But our slice of that is that we want to give you enough information and visibility into the data that you can make good decisions as part of building your product or your pipelines out.
Perfect. Thanks, Brandon. And hopefully, Diana, that answers your question. If it doesn't, please follow up and we'll get into it more for you if we need to. Like I was saying, rather than drone on and on with lots of boring slides, we thought we'd actually get into some action and show you how a telemetry pipeline can handle some of these challenges. And we picked 4, and the first of those is really like what's in the data itself. And as I talked about before, applications and infrastructure components in the stack generate lots of different things. And a lot of times, most of the folks that we talk to are like, man, I'm not even sure what's in there. I wouldn't even know where to start in terms of how do I make use of this? And so how can a telemetry pipeline help you do that? And then typically what follows after that are 2 maybe equally important things, or maybe one more important than the other. The first of those is, okay, man, there's a lot of stuff here, and I'm thinking that I really don't need most of this most of the time. How do I deal with it? How do I kind of filter out the stuff that I don't need, but then potentially bring it back when I do need it? Or maybe I kind of need to keep all of it in some place for compliance reasons, but I don't want to have to put it in expensive places. I want to put it in cheap places. So it's like I want to take it and chop it up, and I want to put it in a lot of different places. What's the best way to do that? And then second, how do I make sure that that there's certain data that shouldn't be in there, like PII data and other things? Like, how do I make sure that's not in there? And if it is, and I can't really work around it, like, how do I redact it? How do I make it go away? Like, what do I do there? And then for the 4th use case, we thought we'd talk a little bit about like, all right, how do I kind of leverage this telemetry data for the greater business good? How can I actually help the business out rather than having them have to go back to app developers and add more code and relaunch and all of that? Are there things in existing telemetry data that I can take advantage of to turn into metrics that'll bring business value? So let's start, Brandon. Let's start with what we think is kind of the most important one, which is the lack of insights and like what's in my data.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll flip over here and kind of give this demo here. And as Bill said, my perspective is that the hardest problem to solve with telemetry data in its current state is understanding what's actually in your data, right? And figuring out, is this piece valuable? Is this not valuable? Do I need to go talk to another dev to figure out, is this, something that we can just throw away or keep, right? And really, that's all in the vein of like, let's try to keep the cost in control for this stuff, right? So I don't have my boss coming, knocking on my door and saying, hey, like, dude, why do I have a 30K extra charge this month on this? Because a developer shipped one line of code and completely, made our overages go way up, right? And so when you look at when you talk about that problem or you think about it, and I've got an example of just some logs here. This is coming from our development environment. I've picked out a couple of apps to demonstrate this with, but one of our apps is we call it Core DNS. And you can see that there's just several log lines in here. There's this, SVRN, here's a URL, UPD, and these kind of look like almost heartbeats or something that is kind of valuable, but maybe not real valuable. And if I kind of scroll around a little bit, like there's a lot of this in here. So just from a human eye perspective, I can see just from this core DNS, like there's a lot of stuff. What we want to do, or we try to do, is let's talk about this from a data first perspective, and give you the visibility and insights to start whittling through that data and see, okay, what can I do with this? So I'm going to switch tabs here and show our profiling stuff. Now, on this profiling screen, the way that we operate is that we set up a shared source for you. That shared source will sample and profile, and by default, we allow 1 million records that can be configured, to your liking, as if you want more data or less data. But we found 1 million records is probably a good sweet spot. Usually, that's 10 to maybe an hour's worth of data, 10 minutes to an hour's worth of data. But 1 million records, like that's going to give me a good sample set. And for this, we actually sampled about a gig worth of data, and we found that there's 3 unique apps and 8 unique hosts as part of this. Now you'll see on here there's a log composition. There's no results because the data that is sent in is JSON. If we were sending something else like common HTTP logs, or we were sending our syslog or just syslog in general, or Nginx logs, we would have different log compositions in here because that really focuses on unstructured data. And that's one of the harder data sets to deal with. But for here, I'm just sending JSON to help show this just a little bit better. Now, on the previous screen, I had showed some logs that had this, AAN, there was a URL, UDP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Out of all the data that we sampled, and again, I've got 3 different applications that are coming in for this data. Roughly of that data set, we've got 342,000 total lines out of the 1 million that we sampled, as well as 45 megabytes of that was a single log line, right? So you can see it's just very verbose. And if we do from a percentage perspective, that's like, I don't know, 8 or 9, maybe 10% roughly of what our total log volume is, right? And so just by looking through this, I can start picking out, okay, here's things that I can actually start to add reduction strategies to, or maybe I just sample it, or maybe I drop it completely. And that's kind of up to you as you build out your telemetry pipelines and how you want to deal with this data stuff, right? So I can scroll on down just a little bit, and you'll see there's some stuff from web app, as well as the 3 that we're sending across is core DNS, web app, and Zookeeper. And if I want a different view of this and say, hey, which hosts are super chatty, right? Here we go. We can actually see like, okay, the core DNS hosts are roughly all about the same, right? Where our pipeline Zookeeper nodes are, very little log volume. And then this obviously coordinates or is connected to the web app stuff. And so here I get just a overall summary or an idea of where do I start, right? Where do I start? Needling through what can I make improvements on in my telemetry data? Where can we go with this? And this is ever evolving for us. We're going to continue to add to this. We're going to make this better. We're actually talking about additional ways to add anomaly detection and those kind of things behind the scenes. So again, we're still kind of working on evolving this. So that's really figuring out what's in the data, right? The next big thing is, now that I know kind of, where some of my pain points are at with this, how do I start getting rid of some of that as part of that too much data conversation? So here I've actually built a telemetry pipeline. This telemetry pipeline is actually hooked to that shared source that's coming in. So all data that is coming in through that source that's being profiled and analyzed, and went through that process. It's also funneling in this pipeline. Okay. And here, I can actually start determining the reduction of this stuff. So if I kind of tap this, we'll see there's some data that's flowing in. You can see that this is real live data that's happening for this guy. If I scroll down just a little bit, I should see a message. So there's a proxy request from this ID to this URL. Okay, and so this is real live data as it's flowing through your system. We can view it, we can evaluate it, we can do stuff with it. Now, to show the reduction bit on how do I actually start getting some data to, or trim down data, or get rid of those records that were the top two in that list. The easiest way for me to show that is if I go ahead and hit Edit Pipeline, we have something that we've built into our product. Again, our philosophy on this is that yes, you can go build this, you can go get NiFi, you can go get Vector. Those are all players in the open source space of telemetry pipelines. What we want to bring is that data capability to yours so that you can easily build these pipelines. You can make sure that they're viable, that you get good results from it, right? So that's the extra adage that Mesmo brings to the table with our product. If I simulate this pipeline, these are saved data sets that I've collected from TAP. If I actually run a simulation, this is going to generate information that's kind of already been stored and start funneling it through our pipeline. So if I click through this, I'm going to ignore this tracking state and incident route. I'll come back to that. But the apps that were generating the most data was this core DNS. So if we look here, I got 100 events coming in, 100 events going out to my route node. I can actually shovel that down to a drop logs and filter node. And here, if you'll notice, there's 100 events that came in and 15 events that went out. So if I click on this top one, and if I'm super lucky, we should see that there is a one that matched their pattern, right? The first one coming in, and this was the AN URL UDP 52 7 false, so on and so forth. On the way out now, we can actually see, if I scroll down to message, that those all messages look to be redacted. And the first one is this actual PTR in this. And if I go back, I could probably actually find that pattern that matches that if I wanted to further reduce that. Okay. So how does that work actually? Well, inside of these nodes here, if I actually edit configuration, and I'll close the simulation for now, we can see that I've got a actual filter. This can drop logs, and I want to drop all the events that match this criteria. And this is a little regex expression that I've written that matches that. And you can basically see it's just if it's an info line and it's got a word with no spaces, dash word with no spaces, anything that starts with a star in there and then so on and so forth for the rest of the regex. It's going to match that and just completely throw those away, right? And so if I go look over here, we're also sending this for remove emails. I'll come back to that because this is how we talk about PII reduction. But I'm actually funneling this stuff onto Datadog. So if I pull up Datadog, I'll pull up my live tail, we can see that none of the data is actually flowing that have that pattern AA, in URL, etc. is actually going through now, okay? Which is pretty cool, right? And you can do this with a lot of other things. Like I know you can actually do filters with FluentBit. You can do filters with log stash if you're using that. You could actually even filter over on Datadog as well and just say, hey, like, let me write an exclusion rule. The big question is why should I do that in a telemetry pipeline? And the biggest reason for it is that you want to shift that control left as far as you can, because Datadog is still going to charge you, right, for the ingress. A lot of the other log analysis vendors, they're going to charge you for that data incoming. And so even though you're telling it to exclude from your retention window, a lot of times that data, you're still being charged for that data set over there. And so with that, right, the next question that we usually get is, okay, well, if I shift my control left and I put it into a telemetry pipeline and I filter the data before it gets to my log analysis, what do I do when I have an issue, right? Because now we've just made a decision like, I don't need this data 90% of the time, like whatever. But let's say we do have an issue. What we can do is I can actually go back over to my monitor of the pipeline, and you will see here, I'll make this just a little bit larger here, that there is actually data flowing through our normal route, right? So we see data coming up, it's kind of flowing here. There's logs that are happening. If I flip this to what we call incident mode, and this can actually be done via a webhook, or it can be done manually in our UI, you can actually go ahead and set this to say, hey, I'm now in incident mode, right? Let's say that there's some errors that happen in Datadog that makes a webhook out to our platform, and you can go do some stuff, right? It'll flip the incident mode. Now I've got data flowing through incident mode on this guy. We'll tap it, let it run for a second. So here's new logs that are coming through, right? And you can see that it's actually flipped to incident. And if I go back up to normal, there's no data going that route, okay? So why is that important? When we're in incident mode, all my data, if I follow the path here, is going directly to Datadog, right? And in fact, I am, skipping over the remove emails. I'm skipping over everything else, right? And this is just a design decision that I made when I was building out this demo pipeline for this presentation. But we can see that all this is going to Datadog. So if I flip over here to Datadog's live tail, now you're going to see, oh, there is AA, we'll scroll down here so we can capture one, in this guy, URL, et cetera, right? And so now we have the capabilities to really change your behavior of what's happening based on, you have outages, you have events. We can go back and say, hey, change the behavior of your pipeline through this incident management.
So, Brandon, of course, I'm going to say it's pretty cool because I love Mesmo, but I think now that the question becomes, though, and I'm assuming that other folks are thinking about this, okay, so something happened where I set an incident, or I realize something's going on, and I'm in my service desk software or whatever, and I trigger an incident. The incident tells the telemetry pipeline, like, hey, I need full fidelity, give me everything, and that starts flowing through. But what happens if the data that I really needed to look at came before I actually set the incident and I was still kind of filtering and doing all that stuff? Like, what do I do now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are internally working on a solution for that, which kind of gives you a time window of rehydration to pull data back from an archive location. So when you build that pipelines, right, it's always a good idea to probably shuffle this data off to a longer term storage like an S3 archive, or you can go to Google Clouds, cloud storage mechanism, right? The idea is shuffle that data off for long term, and that way you can go back, if you need to go back 6 months ago for some compliance reason, or if you needed to go back and say, hey, you've got like a security audit or something, and you're looking for something specific, right? You can store that data off into a longer term storage in S3. What we plan to do is we're going to actually allow for the ingestion of that data from your S3 and pull that back in when you need it, right? So that you can say, hey, I had an incident. Let's go ahead and pull back an hour's worth before the incident, because context matters when there's lots of issues, right? And so we can pull in, an hour, 2 hours worth, or whatever, you configure, so that you can get full fidelity across your stack as part of this.
Okay, that's cool. That makes the whole archiving, rehydration, got it. So, and I actually want to pause here too, because we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A section that I figure we'll get to now, and then we can get on, because we're kind of halfway through the demo, I think, at this point anyway, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so one question from Lynn J. Are there quality assurance measures or data validation techniques employed to verify the reliability of telemetry data? And I've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, that falls into what we call data profiling, right? So it's data profiling classification, right? It's how valid is this data? How valuable is this data? Now, unfortunately, machines can only go so far as showing here's patterns, here's behaviors that we're seeing, like this application last week sent this many gigabytes of data, now it's doubled in size. Hey, look here, like there's something going on, right? um, a lot of times though, those conversations is happening between you and the application developer or the engineer who's building the software, right? Because unfortunately, being in kind of a DevOps role or an SRE role, you're sort of the man in the middle a lot of times, which means
Yeah.
like the application guys go build something, and then you may be responsible for the infrastructure and the Datadog implementation and making sure everything wires together. They're the experts on that data. What we want to do is be able to shine the light on this stuff, and then you can go have that further conversation with your engineers, with whoever that you need to say, hey, what do we want to do about this? Do we need it? Like, I've realized that there's this new thing that's popped up. What's going on over here?
Yeah. All right. So it's this notion of like continuous profiling and not only point in time, but kind of being able to identify changes over time and anomalies and saying like, is that right? Is that not right? Is there something that we need to be aware of? Is this what we expect? Yeah, that makes sense. And then Nadia asked a couple of questions. The first is, how do we secure the telemetry data and at what point and where do we do that?
Yeah. So our philosophy is that when it comes to the telemetry data, security happens in a couple of places. It's who has access to the data, right? Obviously, the person that's building your telemetry pipelines, they're going to have access to the data that flows through it. That's going to be your SREs and your DevOps guys, right? When it comes to security, the thing about the telemetry pipelines is that it is the man in the middle. It only deals with really streaming data, right? Once it's in the pipeline, it's here and it's gone within, a few
Yeah.
milliseconds, right? And so when it comes down to security, it really binds down to where are you sending this data, right? And then how long are you storing it there? So if you have a internal retention policy at your company for telemetry data where it's like, hey, I'm going to store it to S3 for 6 months, or maybe you're, a HIPAA or SOX compliant, you need to store it for 7 years or however long you're contracted to do so, then you can put those measures in place. That stuff is kind of out of scope from a telemetry pipeline because those configurations happen on, let's say, your S3 bucket, right? Or in your Datadog. But we
Yep.
adhere to, from a security perspective, making sure that your data is secure, it's encrypted as we send it to Datadog. As we receive it in, we can receive it encrypted and translate it. We can even encrypt things in the pipeline given a hash key that you've determined. You say, hey, like, I don't want anybody to ever see this again, so I'm going to apply an encryption algorithm across the logs as they come across, and then decrypt them in S3 for later security purposes, right? That's really up to your company and your implementation decisions.
Perfect. And then the follow up from her, and this one's interesting. Do you separately obtain consent for telemetry data collation? And how does the data collation work when you work with businesses? So
Yeah.
yeah, okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So if I understand your question correctly, for us, we obviously sign NDAs. Mesmo as a company, we are SOC 2 compliant, we're HIPAA compliant, we're EDI compliant. Like we're all the compliance down, the middle, and we take pride in that. Um, you know there's two ways that we do this. If you would like our help with the profiling side of this stuff, is that we sign an NDA, you can send us your data, or there's actually an on-prem option where, hey, we can profile your data on-prem, that way it doesn't leave your network. Again, that depends on what's easier for you, and that's kind of the stance or tack that we took, is that we want to provide options for people that are highly technical and very technical DevOps teams. Like, if you're comfortable running your own infrastructure, your own hardware, everything for this, you can. Awesome. But if you need more of a quick solution, I'd rather have the SaaS. I don't want to worry about hosting that. We can also do that as well.
Yeah, perfect. Um, and then finally, and then we can get into the back half of the demo. What metrics, this is from Geetha S, what metrics and KPIs do you track to evaluate the effectiveness of the pipeline. And actually, this probably tees up the second half of the demo pretty well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's good.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll flip back over here to the screens here. So for us, the effectiveness of the pipeline here is you can actually see, how much data we're sending in and how much data we're sending out. So total, this is over the last 3 hours. This pipeline's received 3.26 gigabytes of telemetry data. Now I've egressed 4.8 or 4.18 gigs, and
I thought
you
we were
said,
reducing, Brandon. What's going on?
yeah, exactly, Brandon. Why are we doing this? Like I thought we were getting a reduction. The beauty of these pipelines, or the beauty of this technology, is that I have one central point for my data to come in, right? And you can have multiple central points depending on how you want to organize or orchestrate your pipeline development. Um, but I can send out to multiple locations. And so for this one here, I'm actually sending this data onto 3 locations. I'm sending it to Grafana, I'm sending it to Datadog, and I'm actually sending it to S3 Archive as well. So the S3 Archive, if we see, like, here's the rate over the last 10 minutes, it's been about 197 kilobytes a second, right? That should match the inbound or be relatively close is the 207.21. Now, obviously, there's some time duration between here and when it goes to the pipes for a few milliseconds, so that's why it's going to be off just a little bit. Or they just updated it instantly, right? And so you can see, well, from a reduction standpoint, like I've thrown away quite a bit because to Datadog, I'm only sending 56 kilobytes a second. And here I'm sending 216, which is the full fidelity of the data, right? Grafana is even smaller. We're just a few hundred bytes every 10 minutes or bytes per second that way, right? And so that's, for us, that's how you start measuring the effectiveness. Now, as part of our profiling solution, and what we're baking out is that eventually we want to give you a centralized viewpoint so that you can say, hey, here's how much is data coming in from a source, and I want to actually do a complete diff on the destination and be able to legitimately see, like, here's how much data I've sent out in the last few hours to this location, and here's how much data we've seen in. So you can literally get a side-by-side comparison to see how much reduction are we achieving. And those reduction numbers matter, right? Because eventually in the pipeline, we talk about incident resolutions for this stuff. Like, you can build that capability to say, hey, you know what? Like, once we hit a threshold on Datadog, let's say that our retention in Datadog or some other, seam out there is that, I only want to store 10 gigabytes a month, right? Well, as part of the telemetry pipeline, as you get close to that threshold, we can throttle or change rules in the pipeline to be able to, make sure that you're under that threshold. And that may be turn on more sampling, or like, we're going to put a hard stop in here. Once you hit the threshold, like, I don't want to pay that Datadog bill, just completely.
Yeah, but basically make sure I never have an overage again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all that comes from being able to, continuously profile that data or to sample it and to make sure, what's going on, give you really clear visibility into that stuff.
Yeah. All right. So we talked about profiling and understanding what's in there. We talked about, okay, now that I know what's in there, how do I reduce it? Let's talk about now, like, how do I make sure that there might be some stuff that shouldn't be in there, and how do I make that go away or redact that out?
Yeah, beautiful. All right, so I've actually set up another simulation here. We're going to talk about emails. When it comes to email addresses, I'll go ahead and simulate this guy. We'll do an email simulation. You can see if I click on this, really simple. I just kind of crafted this by hand. I did not use a tab for this demo purposes, but I've got 2 logs that go through. One's an email, one's a string data. Now, because we're back in normal mode, or go through the unmatched mode, right? This is kind of the catch-all if there's nothing set. But here we can see that it's going to go through the unmatched route because there's no app or host that's tied to it. If we click on this guy, you'll see in the right-hand side that the email is the same coming out of this node as it was. The log message isn't changed. If I follow this line down here, you'll see that it goes to this remove emails. So at this point, what it does, or what we've kind of built into our software, is to say, hey, if there's any emails, right, and it could be credit card numbers, it could be IP addresses, it could be social security numbers. We've already baked out several different patterns for you to leverage and use to make it, again, simpler so you don't have to go implement all this logic on your own if you're to go pull Vector or some other open source telemetry pipeline. We actually go ahead and encrypt these for you. So if I look at this configuration here, and we'll close this down or make this smaller. Here we say, hey, any data that's coming into any field underneath the root of the message, right? If it's JSON, and if you don't put anything in here, it's just going to check for strings, say, hey, is there anything in here, right? We want to look for email addresses, and we actually want to hash them, right? Now, you could actually replace it, or you put a hard-coded value in there if you want it as like, this was an email or whatever. But for this one, I just hash it, and we're going to use a SHA-1 hash. Now, that's important because that email is always going to hash the same value. And so if I needed to, figure out later on through analytics or something, I wanted to tie that back together to say, hey, what are all the logs or the events that have this email in it? As long as I use the same hash algorithm, I can go find that information downstream, right? Without storing that data, right? Or keeping it, right? And so for us, again, we have different patterns here: email, IP address, credit card number, really depending on your own business that you're in, or what kind of data you have. We also support custom patterns. So if you have a regex expression you want to plop in here, something that's proprietary to your business, then you can drop that right in there, and we will hash that as well and keep your data super secure so that no email pass through as a whoops-a-daisy because a application guy or somebody accidentally turned on a log somewhere.
Some verbose logging, and
Yeah.
So let me pause you because Charles B had asked a question a while back about this very same thing. He was talking about telemetry data with things like VIN numbers and vehicle information, and could we redact it and still be able to analyze the telemetry data? And so there's a great example of where you could do a custom redaction and redact out a VIN number or something like that. And as long as you use the same hash algorithm, you'd be able to still do analysis and even generate metrics and things like that on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, that's a good feeling to have that security in your back pocket where, you don't have to worry about answering to somebody, your boss or somebody, that look, like, how did these social security numbers flip in here, right?
Where
And
did that come from?
yeah, small story. I worked at a job where we had some POS software that was running. That's, again, point of sale solutions, right? And at one point in my career, I did see credit card numbers just being written right out to log files. And that was a very scary moment. And I wish we had a telemetry pipeline back in the day. This was like 15 years ago now. But man, that would have saved some butts on that. So
For sure.
yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. So again, we redact the emails and then we can send it on to Datadog, right? And you'll see. We'll flip back over here to monitor the pipeline so we can see some real data flowing through.
Okay. And then I think the last thing we were going to talk about is how do we help the business out with more maybe business related metrics or extract some interesting data out of the telemetry log that isn't necessarily focused on like observability or incident resolution or things like that.
Yep. Good question. So one of the things about telemetry pipelines, and this is kind of unique in this space without you having to go write a lot of code, is that a lot of times there's things inside of your log data that could be super valuable, right? Sometimes it's valuable to an SRE, as in, the only place that I'm getting this data is in a log, and it may be like, how long did this process take, right? And you could go write a metric for that. You could go build that out, or have your app guy go implement that metric. Now I've got the same data point coming out two different channels, right? One's in logs, one's now in your metrics over here. And depending on how it's implemented, they may be the same, they may be different. You never know. So it's always good to get to kind of a single source of this stuff. And if something's already been emitted in logs, maybe I want to convert that to a metric and send it downstream, right? If we're talking about business solutions, maybe it's the number of transactions that are happening at my store, or it's the number of customers we're serving, or anything of that, right? I can take those logs that have that information and go build dashboards for it, right? From an SRE perspective, what may be really valuable is how slow is this stuff running, right? If I'm not generating the metrics. So I'm going to show the kind of SRE, the DevOps side of this where, I've got something coming through. I'd rather just utilize that data and leverage it, and instead of me having to go build that out. So if we go back over here to this data profile, and I'll scroll down here, this web app one is the one I'm actually looking at here. And so this is pipeline proxy response from, this is a ID to a URL with elapsed time. To actually show that, and as it's flowing through pipeline, that we're actually tapping that, I've got all web app traffic, right? Because that's who it's coming from, going through this route here where if there's a proxy response that's happening, and I'll actually tap this data so that we can see it. Here, you'll see that, I'll make this just a little bit larger, that coming through, there should be some pipeline proxy response from, here's a ID to a URL, right? Within a elapsed time of 4, and that's milliseconds, okay? That's awesome. I want to pull that out, and I want to turn that into a metric and do something cool with it, right? So we'll go ahead and close that out. Let me make this a little bit better so we can see it. So here I can actually parse that data. And after I'll show you this data point, I will show you how we do the parse bit. Here you can see that there's an extracted field that now comes out that says the elapsed time in milliseconds is 3. The pipeline ID is this. The URL is, this URL, okay? And if we actually want to say, okay, how did we pull that from the log line? We'll hit view config here, and we say, hey, look in the message field and pull out a extracted, right? I want you to take the data that we pull out, put it into a field called extracted, and then leverage a grok parser. We have several parsers that you can leverage, regex, grok, etc. And I made a little grok expression that will map up and pull those values out. So we have a pipeline ID, we've got a URL, and an elapsed time, right, that matches this. So if I now go and say, okay, the data is being pulled out, it's being parsed, let me convert that thing to a metric. And if we look here, now we're going to actually see, I'm actually going to take this, turn it into a counter, extract the elapsed time in milliseconds out to a value field, and give us some tags of pipeline ID and a URL. Now, without having to go change my code in an application, I can go convert those log lines into a metric that I want to route through my pipeline. In this instance, I'm actually sending it to Grafana Cloud here. And this is using a Prometheus remote write so that it's writing to kind of their instantiation or implementation of Prometheus. And I can then go build dashboards that look kind of like this, that will actually give me a breakdown of, here's the average response time by URL. And if I'm sitting in a DevOps seat, I'm going to say, well, why is this analysis thing taking 18, seconds effectively to run, where, this log clustering, it's, taking about, 2 seconds or whatever as an average response time. Well, that's because there's some maximum responses that are happening based on that data, which is this analysis. The maximum one is 58 seconds for that to return. Okay, maybe we got a problem. Maybe I would set up an alert in my product, right, to then go trigger my pipeline to collect more data to do whatever. And really all that's skewed by, well, this ID here is really what's causing that issue, right? It's got the long delay times here, where everything else seems to be pretty healthy, right? It's all green throughout this. Response times are pretty average throughout here, right? And so it's really that idea of like, let me not go redo the work and have to worry about cramming that data, or go modifying my application. Let me take that log data that's coming out, that's rich, that has lots of information, that if you're logging, best practices, it's always better to log more things and then reduce things throughout your flow, right? Reduce things in the pipeline, get rid of what you need, because the standard with log data is, especially when you're troubleshooting outages, is like, if I if I don't log all the things and I have an issue, it's going to be much harder to troubleshoot in the future. And so you're always better off like, let me just send everything. And that's kind of how we got into this predicament, anyways, with cost overages and whatnot, because that was the principle, that was the practice of let me log pretty much everything. And now we need a solution in place that says, you know what, let me actually filter and pick out and make some decisions, but be able to keep full fidelity should I need it.
Yeah, now you can log everything, and it's not this big mound of data that you got a needle in a haystack, search for. It's actually, you can do lots of things with it, and with the flexibility inside of a pipeline of being able to parse things and break them apart and then repackage them in the data format that you showed there. Like, I think that's this is how you in effect use this telemetry data with confidence, right? So just as a quick wrap up, wanted to just go back and recap for you that, first of all, we talked about, like, one of the biggest challenges, probably the most important thing to figure out, is what's in there to begin with, right? So that you know how to make use of it. Two, how do I put some controls around how I'm using it in terms of volume and sending stuff to the right place, and then getting back full fidelity when I need it. Third, we talked about how do I redact or remove some of the data that might sneak in there that really shouldn't be in there for security and compliance reasons or other reasons. And then finally, how can I take advantage of the data that's in there and do more with it, whether it's a business insight or it's, even as in our example, it's around site performance and being able to tune site performance and identify issues where we can make improvements and things like that. So that was everything that we had prepared. And man, look at that. We used up most of the time, but I think we were good in kind of answering questions as they came. But we certainly have a couple more minutes if anyone else has any other questions that they'd like to ask before we wrap. And hopefully, Cody, I did a decent job of trying to manage questions and keep things going at the same time.
Absolutely, I think you did. We did forget to launch one poll, so we'll go ahead and launch that now. Launch that now.
That's a good idea. Yeah, man, I forgot about that. Thanks, Cody, for bringing that up.
No worries.
So the fourth.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So the four things that we showed, I would just ask, like, which one did you all find to be maybe the most important, or what was the most interesting? I guess I would say to you, and if you could just take a couple of seconds to answer that. Yeah, I was supposed to prompt you for that, wasn't I? And I didn't. My bad.
No worries, no worries. So while we get a couple of responses here, I'll just run through a couple of my notes here. So for everyone, our session was recorded today. We'll be sending it to you via email here shortly, but you can also access it on the DevOps website. That's devops.com/webinars. And I'd also like to thank everyone for their chats and their questions. Those have made you eligible for our gift card giveaway. If you look at the chat as well as in the handouts, you'll see a link to our survey. So filling that out for us would make you eligible as well. So let's see what kind of responses we've received for our poll question number 2.
Yeah, no surprise on the PII data, of course. Interesting. And maybe worth mentioning, for those who've indicated like data profiling to understand what telemetry data you have, there's a link in the handouts, isn't there, in the handout section? Yeah, where we give you, we'll spend a little time with you and do some data profiling for you if that's something that you're interested in. So we're certainly happy to do that for those of you interested in getting that.
All right. Well, Bill and Brandon, it has been such a pleasure speaking with you, hearing from you today. So thank you so much for joining us on Techstrong Learning. It's been a blast.
Awesome. Thanks, Cody.
All right. So just a couple final remarks. Thank you to Bill and Brandon. I would like to thank Mesmo for sponsoring our program today. And to you, our audience, thank you so much for being here and for engaging with us. We appreciate you spending your time here with us here at Techstrong Learning, and we hope to see you at a future learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, everyone, and you may now disconnect. Thanks again, Bill and Brandon.
Thanks.